It was a crisp evening in downtown Los Angeles, the kind where the city lights gleamed like stars caught in a web of concrete and glass. The streets pulsed with the energy of thousands of people, each caught in the rush of their own lives, cars honking, pedestrians weaving between each other, the occasional shout of a street vendor. Above all, the hum of the city was underscored by the sharp, cool wind that swept between the tall buildings, brushing against faces and sending a chill through the air. The city, in all its vastness, felt both alive and empty at the same time. There, among it all, Barron Trump walked, his figure largely unnoticed by the crowd. Barron wasn't the typical figure to be seen wandering the streets of downtown LA, especially at this hour. He was a familiar face, of course, but always within the confines of private estates, high-profile events, and the business of a world that didn't often leave room for personal reflection. But tonight he had taken a different path. Despite the constant buzz of his family's political and business obligations, Barron craved something outside the usual routines. It had been a long week of meetings and interviews, discussions that never seemed to end, and endless expectations placed on his shoulders as part of one of the most well-known families in the country. But tonight he stepped away. For once, he wasn't wearing a suit or attending a charity gala. He wasn't worrying about the next speech or the next big business deal. Wrapped in a simple jacket, he slipped into the streets of LA with nothing but his thoughts and the fading light of a setting sun. He walked with no particular destination in mind, his steps slow as he observed the world around him. People hurried by, their faces illuminated by neon signs and storefronts, their eyes fixed on their phones or lost in their own worlds. It was the usual rhythm of the city, constant, unyielding, and indifferent. The sound of tires against pavement, voices rising above the traffic, music drifting out of open windows, all of it blended together, a cacophony of life moving forward. For a brief moment, Barron found himself detached from it all, his mind quiet. There was something strangely calming about the chaos. No obligations, no interviews, no meetings, just the city, the night, and him. It felt freeing, in a way. He found himself drifting toward a small park just off the main boulevard, a patch of green where trees loomed like silent witnesses to the world outside. The park was relatively empty, save for a few late-night walkers and the soft murmur of distant conversations. As Barron made his way through the park, something caught his attention. The sight of a figure beneath one of the street lamps made him stop in his tracks. It was a small, hunched shape, too still, too small to be an adult. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light, Barron saw the boy, no older than 12 or 13, curled up on a wooden bench. The boy's small body was shivering under the faint glow of the street lamp, his clothes ragged and worn. He had no blanket, no pillow, nothing to protect him from the cold, but an old backpack that served as his makeshift pillow. Barron's heart tightened. The boy was asleep, but he was far from safe. Barron stood still for a moment, watching the boy. The city continued to move around him, cars passing, people walking by, yet no one seemed to notice. It was as if the boy, so young and vulnerable, had become invisible to the world. People rushed past, too absorbed in their own lives to notice the child huddling against the cold night. But Barron couldn't ignore it. He stepped closer, drawn to the boy in a way he couldn't explain. There was a sadness in the air, a stillness that made everything feel heavier. Barron's breath caught in his throat. How could this child be alone like this? How had the world let this happen? His thoughts shifted, and for a fleeting moment, Barron found himself thinking back to his own childhood. Growing up had not been without its challenges, living in the shadow of immense expectations, a life where every move was watched, every mistake magnified. But Barron had always had a roof over his head, a place where he could feel safe. This boy, on the other hand, had nothing. No family, no security, no future to hold on to. Barron stood there, debating with himself. He could walk away, keep to his path, and forget what he had seen. It was just one homeless child, after all. But deep down, he knew he couldn't. Something inside him told him he couldn't just leave. As he approached the bench, Barron took a deep breath, his footsteps soft against the pavement. He crouched down gently beside the boy, careful not to wake him too suddenly. "Hey, buddy," Barron said quietly, his voice calm and kind. The boy stirred, blinking awake. For a moment, there was confusion in his eyes as he looked up at Barron. Who was this stranger, and why was he speaking to him? The boy rubbed his eyes and sat up, looking at Barron with a mix of wariness and curiosity. Barron offered a small smile, trying to put him at ease. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice still gentle. The boy, who introduced himself as Danny, hesitated before responding. His voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm fine," but Barron could see the weariness in his eyes, the deep exhaustion of someone who had been through more than a child should have to endure. In that moment, Barron knew that this was more than just a passing encounter. This was a moment that had the potential to change everything for both of them. It was the faint, unfamiliar noise of a rustling in the distance that first caught Barron Trump's attention. As he wandered through the winding streets of downtown Los Angeles, lost in the constant hum of the city, the sound seemed out of place, something different amid the usual city buzz. People rushed by, unaware of the world outside their own heads, as Barron slipped through the shadows of the towering buildings. The evening was growing colder, the faint breeze turning into a crisp chill that sliced through the busy streets. Barron had left his usual world behind for a few hours, deciding to escape the tight grip of his family's expectations. He wanted to breathe, to see life as it was, not as it was presented to him through the lens of power and influence. The world outside the glass and steel boundaries of his daily life felt raw, unfiltered. As he made his way through the quieter part of downtown, he stumbled upon a small, unkempt park tucked away between two old brick buildings. The green was more shadow than grass, the trees skeletal figures that looked more at home in a winter forest than in the middle of a sprawling city. Barron didn't plan on stopping. It wasn't the sort of place someone like him would typically visit, but something made him pause. The air grew even colder, and that's when he noticed him. The small, hunched figure curled up on a weathered wooden bench under the flickering light of a street lamp. It was a boy, no older than 12 or 13, his body wrapped in nothing more than a thin, torn jacket. He was lying on his side, his knees drawn up to his chest in a futile attempt to shield himself from the night's bite. His face was pale, his eyes closed, though they were far from peaceful. Even from a distance, Barron could tell that the boy was shivering, his body shaking slightly from the cold. No blanket, no pillow, just a ragged backpack under his head, as though the object itself was the only semblance of comfort he had left. The sight stopped Barron in his tracks. He couldn't explain why, but something about this moment, this boy, struck him deep within his chest. It was more than just the shock of seeing a child abandoned in the streets of a city that thrived on wealth and opportunity. It was the undeniable feeling of helplessness that washed over him. People walked past, oblivious to the child. The boy was like a ghost in the middle of a living city, and the indifference of the world around him only seemed to make the scene more tragic. Barron's thoughts swirled, his mind reeling as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. He walked closer, his steps slow, careful not to disturb the boy's fragile sleep. As he neared the bench, Barron hesitated. He wasn't the type to approach strangers, especially not children. But there was something about this boy, something that didn't sit right. Barron leaned down, keeping his voice soft, gentle. "Hey, buddy," he said, his words breaking the silence of the park. The boy stirred, blinking open tired eyes that were dull with exhaustion. For a moment he looked up at Barron with confusion, his mind struggling to process the appearance of a stranger in his otherwise solitary world. "Are you okay?" Barron asked again, his voice low and kind, as if hoping to offer some form of comfort without overwhelming the boy. The boy rubbed his eyes and sat up slightly, his movements slow, as though it took all his energy just to shift his body. He looked up at Barron, his face pale and fragile, a stark contrast to the busy, chaotic world Barron was accustomed to. His clothes were torn, his shoes barely held together by fraying laces. He appeared as though he had been on the streets for far too long. "I'm fine," the boy whispered, but there was no conviction in his voice. Barron could tell instantly that it wasn't true. "What's your name?" he asked, trying to bring some human connection into this disorienting moment. The boy hesitated, his eyes scanning Barron's face for any sign of danger. "Danny," he said softly, barely audible, his voice betraying a sense of vulnerability that Barron couldn't ignore. "Danny," Barron repeated, as if to make the name real, as if to say that this boy was not just another statistic or faceless figure on the sidewalk. Barron's heart tightened. "What are you doing out here, Danny? Don't you have somewhere to go?" The boy's eyes dropped, staring at the pavement. There was a long silence before he spoke again, his voice breaking with the weight of his words. "I don't have a home anymore," Danny said, his words heavy with sorrow. "My mum. She couldn't take care of me anymore. She left." Barron's stomach turned. The weight of the boy's words hung in the air, heavier than the cold night itself. This wasn't some far-off story he had read about in newspapers or heard on the news. This was real. This was a child, barely a teenager, alone in the world, without the one thing every person should have: a home, a place of safety. Barron felt an unfamiliar ache in his chest, as though the boy's pain had suddenly become his own. "How long have you been out here?" Barron asked softly, though he wasn't sure if he wanted to hear the answer. Danny shrugged, his gaze still downcast. "A few months," he said quietly. "I try to stay in shelters, but sometimes there's no space, so I just sleep here." The boy's voice trailed off, his words spoken with a quiet resignation that tore at Barron's heart. For a long moment, Barron didn't speak. He stood there, watching the boy, processing the depth of what he was hearing. In that instant, the world outside the park, the one Barron was so familiar with, the one filled with luxury, power, and influence, seemed like an entirely different reality. It was hard to believe that this boy, this child, had no place to go, no one to turn to. It was a jarring realization. Barron stood there, the weight of the world pressing down on him, and wondered what he could do to change it. But one thing was certain: this moment, this boy, was not something he could simply walk away from. Barron stood silently next to the bench, his mind spinning with questions and emotions he wasn't sure how to handle. The night air had grown colder, and the city's ever-present hum seemed distant, muffled, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. The boy, Danny, was now sitting upright, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Barron could see the weariness etched on his young face. His skin was pale, his eyes heavy, and his expression was a mixture of sadness and a kind of defeated acceptance. It struck Barron that Danny wasn't just another homeless person he'd passed on the streets. He was a child, an innocent who had been dealt a cruel hand. Barron shifted uncomfortably, feeling the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. The city around them seemed to move in fast-forward, people hurrying to their destinations, oblivious to the quiet scene unfolding just a few feet away. He felt out of place in this world, as if there was a chasm between the life he knew and the harsh reality Danny was facing. He wanted to help, but the words seemed to stick in his throat. What could he possibly say to make this better? How could he, someone who had never known such hardship, truly understand what Danny was going through? The boy looked up at Barron, his eyes uncertain but searching for something: a flicker of hope, perhaps, or just the reassurance that he wasn't invisible. Barron cleared his throat, trying to steady his voice. "Danny," he said softly, his words feeling almost fragile in the stillness, "I know things must be hard. I can't pretend to know what you're going through, but I want to understand." Danny's gaze faltered, his eyes downcast, as though the weight of the world was too much to carry. "It doesn't really matter," he muttered. "I don't think anything's going to change." Barron could hear the hopelessness in the boy's voice, and it made his heart ache. How had a child so young come to believe that nothing could change? Barron crouched down, his knees creaking slightly as he lowered himself to Danny's level, trying to meet the boy's eyes. "It matters to me," Barron said quietly, his voice sincere. "I want to help you. I know this isn't the life you imagined, but that doesn't mean it has to be the rest of your life." For a moment, Danny didn't respond. He simply stared at the ground, as if the words didn't register. Barron could see the boy's defenses, the walls he had built around himself in order to survive. "Why?" Danny asked suddenly, his voice sharp with suspicion. "Why are you talking to me? People like you don't care about people like me." Barron felt a pang in his chest. He had always been the privileged one, the one who had never known true struggle, and yet here he was, trying to bridge a gap he didn't fully understand. He searched for an answer, something that would break through the boy's walls. "Because I see you," Barron said simply, his words carrying more weight than he had expected. "I see you, Danny, and I believe you deserve a chance, a real chance. Not just to survive, but to live, to dream." Danny's eyes flickered with a mixture of confusion and curiosity. He shifted on the bench, the uncomfortable silence stretching between them. Barron could feel the boy's wariness, the layers of hurt that had built up over months, maybe years. "I don't know if I can believe that," Danny whispered, his voice barely audible. "I've had dreams, but they've never meant anything. I don't even know what hope feels like anymore." Barron's heart clenched. He wanted to reach out, to take this boy's pain away, but he knew that wasn't something he could do. What he could do, however, was listen, and in that moment, listening seemed like the most important thing. "You've had dreams?" Barron asked gently. "What kind of dreams?" Danny hesitated, a flicker of something regret, maybe passing through his eyes. "I wanted to be an engineer," he said, his voice softening as he spoke about something close to his heart. "I like math and science. I wanted to build rockets, like the people who make the cars and the things in space. But it's not possible now. I can't go to school. I can't do any of that stuff." Barron leaned forward slightly, sensing the shift in the boy's tone. For the first time, Danny sounded less defeated, as though something inside him was still fighting. Barron smiled gently. "You're still a kid, Danny," he said, his voice steady. "You've got plenty of time to figure out what you want to do. And if you want to build rockets and work with science, you can. But you have to believe that you can." Danny looked at Barron, his eyes wide with disbelief. "You think I can?" he asked, his voice tinged with wonder. "You really think I can do that?" Barron nodded. "I do," he said firmly. "And I'm not just saying that to make you feel better. You've got something inside of you, Danny. You've got potential. But you need a chance, a real one. You need a place to live. You need to get back in school. You need people who will believe in you." For the first time, Barron saw a flicker of hope in the boy's eyes. It was small, fragile, but it was there. "You'll help me," Danny whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Barron took a deep breath, standing up straight. "Yes," he said with conviction. "I'm going to help you. But more importantly, I'm going to make sure you have the tools to help yourself. This is just the beginning, Danny. We've got a lot of work to do, but we'll get there together." As he watched Danny's eyes brighten, Barron felt a quiet sense of accomplishment, as though something real and important was beginning to unfold between them. It was a long road ahead, but at that moment, Barron knew he was doing something that mattered. For Danny, and for himself. Barron stood there for a long moment, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. The cold air bit at his skin, but it wasn't the chill of the night that made him shiver. It was the realization that this moment, this encounter with Danny, was not something he could walk away from. The boy sitting on the bench, with his worn clothes and hollow eyes, was more than just another homeless child. He was a reminder of everything Barron had taken for granted, and it stirred something deep inside him. He couldn't just go on with his life, knowing there was a chance to make a real difference. Danny's quiet voice lingered in Barron's mind. "You think I can do that?" The words struck Barron more than he expected. The boy had dreams, but no hope. He wanted to build rockets, to explore the world of science, to break free from the cruel circumstances that had defined his young life. But all that potential was buried beneath layers of pain and survival instincts. It hit Barron like a tidal wave, the sudden, overwhelming need to help, to do something concrete, not just offer empty words of encouragement. Barron paced in the dim light, his mind racing. The first step was clear. He couldn't leave the boy here, alone, exposed to the harshness of the streets. He had to get him off that bench, get him into safety. But beyond that, what could he offer? He wasn't an expert in child welfare, and he didn't have all the answers. But he had resources, and more importantly, he had the drive to help. Barron ran a hand through his hair, steeling himself. He didn't need to have all the solutions tonight, but he needed to start. "Danny," Barron said, his voice breaking the silence. The boy looked up, his eyes uncertain. Barron's heart clenched at the way Danny's gaze flitted from him to the dark street, as though he didn't know whether to trust him. "I know you're probably skeptical, but I'm serious about helping you," Barron continued, trying to steady his breath. "I'm not just talking about giving you a meal or a place to sleep for the night. I want to do more than that. I want to help you get back on your feet, to get back to school, and to make sure you have the opportunities you deserve." Danny blinked, confused and unsure of what to make of Barron's words. "How? What do you mean?" he asked, his voice quiet but tinged with a hint of hope. Barron paused, thinking carefully. "I want to make sure you have a place to stay," he said, his voice firm with resolve. "No more sleeping on benches, no more wondering where your next meal is coming from. I'll take care of that. But there's more. I'll make sure you get the support you need, someone to help you catch up on your schoolwork, someone to guide you. I won't let you give up on your dreams." The silence stretched between them again, but this time it felt different. Barron saw a glimmer in Danny's eyes, something between disbelief and a flicker of hope. He could see the boy trying to process what he was hearing, trying to decide whether he could believe in this offer. It wasn't just about a roof over his head or food to eat. It was about the chance to rise above everything that had been stacked against him. It was the chance to rebuild his life. "I can't promise you that everything will be easy," Barron said, his voice softer now but firm. "I know life can be cruel, but I can promise you that I'll be here to help you every step of the way. You don't have to do this alone." Danny stared at him, his young face full of emotion. For a moment, Barron thought the boy might cry, but instead, Danny simply nodded, a single tear slipping down his cheek. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice trembling. "You don't even know me." Barron felt his heart tighten. "I know enough," he replied quietly. "I know what it feels like to be lost, to want more, to dream of something better. I'm not doing this because I feel sorry for you, Danny. I'm doing it because you deserve a chance. You deserve to have someone who believes in you." For the first time, Danny seemed to breathe a little easier. There was no immediate rush of excitement or joy, but Barron could see the change in the boy's demeanor, a slight shift, a softening of his guarded stance. He wasn't sure yet, but he was willing to trust Barron, and that was the first step. Barron pulled out his phone, already making plans. "I'm going to make a few calls," he said, his voice steady. "Let's get you to a safe place tonight, and we'll figure out everything else tomorrow. You'll have food, a bed, and everything you need to start fresh. No more waiting in the cold." Danny looked at Barron, his expression a mix of disbelief and gratitude. "Are you sure?" he asked in a small voice. Barron smiled, a reassuring smile that spoke of commitment. "I'm sure. This is just the beginning, Danny. You've got a future ahead of you, and I'm going to help you build it." As Barron made the arrangements for Danny's immediate needs, he felt a quiet determination take root inside him. He didn't know how long the road ahead would be, or how many obstacles they would face. But he knew one thing for sure: this was the start of something important. He wasn't just offering Danny a place to stay for the night. He was offering him the chance to rebuild his life, to chase his dreams, and to see the world not as a series of insurmountable challenges, but as a place full of possibilities. Barron's heart swelled with purpose. The decision had been made, and nothing, not even the complexities of the world outside, was going to stop him from keeping his promise. Barron didn't waste any time. The decision had been made, and the urgency of it hit him with a force that left no room for hesitation. As soon as the words left his mouth, he was already pulling out his phone, typing in the contact information of his most trusted assistant. He couldn't afford to let this moment slip by. Danny needed stability, and Barron knew that time was precious. The longer he waited, the more likely it was that the boy's hope would fade, replaced by the cruel reality of the streets once again. "Book a room for Danny. Somewhere close to downtown, something safe, something comfortable," Barron instructed. His voice was calm, but there was a steely determination beneath it. He was used to acting quickly, but this felt different. This wasn't a business deal, a negotiation, or a strategy session. It was a promise, and Barron wasn't about to break it. He could hear the assistant on the other end of the line scrambling to make the necessary arrangements. Barron turned his attention back to Danny, who was still sitting on the bench, a mixture of disbelief and gratitude painted across his face. The boy had never known anything like this. People had walked past him every night, ignored him, avoided his gaze as if his existence didn't matter. But here was Barron, a complete stranger, telling him that his life was about to change. Barron's mind was already racing ahead, planning the next steps. He couldn't just give Danny a roof over his head for one night. He needed to help the boy build a future, to ensure that he wasn't just temporarily out of danger, but on the path to something better. Barron thought of his own childhood, of the people who had given him opportunities when he needed them most. He wasn't just offering Danny charity, he was offering him the tools to rebuild his life. The assistant on the other end of the phone confirmed the reservation, and Barron's heart gave a small sigh of relief. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but at least for tonight, Danny would be safe. The warmth of a bed, the comfort of food, things Barron had long taken for granted, would be the foundation for what came next. Turning back to Danny, Barron extended a hand. "Come on," he said softly. "We're going to get you out of here. Let's get you to that hotel and start planning for tomorrow." Danny looked at the hand for a moment, hesitant, as if unsure whether to believe this was really happening. The world had taught him not to trust promises so many people had made them before, only to break them. But something about Barron's unwavering gaze made him feel like he could believe in this moment. Tentatively, Danny reached out and took Barron's hand. The contact was brief but meaningful. For the first time in a long time, Danny didn't feel entirely alone. The car arrived minutes later, sleek and dark, a stark contrast to the dim surroundings of the park. Barron opened the door for Danny, motioning for him to get in. The boy hesitated for just a moment before sliding into the back seat. Barron followed, settling in beside him. The car pulled away from the curb, the noise of the city gradually fading into the distance. As they drove through the streets of Los Angeles, Barron glanced over at Danny, who had his hands clasped tightly in his lap. The boy's eyes were wide, as if he still couldn't quite process what was happening. Barron wondered what thoughts were going through his head. Did he believe this would last? Did he think this was just another fleeting kindness from a stranger? Barron hoped not, but he understood if he did. The hotel wasn't far, just a short drive away. It was modest, but it had everything Danny needed for the night: a bed, warmth, security. As they arrived, Barron motioned for the bellboy to bring their bags inside. He turned to Danny, his expression serious yet comforting. "This is just the start," he said. "Tomorrow we'll figure out the next steps. But for now, get some rest. You've earned it." Danny nodded, his eyes a mixture of exhaustion and gratitude. As Barron walked him to the door of the room, he paused. "I know this doesn't change everything overnight," Barron said, his voice low but steady. "But this is a place to start. You're not invisible anymore. You have a chance." Danny stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking at Barron as if searching for some kind of assurance. Barron gave him a small smile, trying to reassure him that this wasn't just an act of charity, it was the beginning of something real, something lasting. As Danny closed the door, Barron felt a quiet satisfaction settle over him. He had taken the first step, but there was still so much to do. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions to make. But for tonight, Barron allowed himself to believe in the possibility of change. Danny had taken that first step into a future that didn't have to be defined by the harshness of the streets. And for Barron, that was everything. The morning light seeped through the curtains, gently pulling Danny out of the deep sleep he hadn't realized he needed so badly. He stirred, feeling the warmth of the bed around him, a stark contrast to the cold bench he had left behind the night before. For a moment he lay there, blinking in disbelief, wondering if it had all been a dream: the kindness, the warmth, the comfort of a room that wasn't a temporary refuge but a safe place. He sat up slowly, feeling the unfamiliar softness of the sheets, the quiet hum of the city outside, so different from the usual noise of the streets. It was real. As he sat on the edge of the bed, the knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Danny wasn't sure what to expect, but when he opened the door, he found Barron standing there, a smile on his face and a tray of food in his hands. The aroma of fresh pancakes, eggs, and bacon filled the room, and Danny's stomach growled in response. It had been months since he'd eaten anything that felt like a proper meal. His eyes widened as he took in the sight of the food, the luxury of it overwhelming in its simplicity. "Good morning," Barron said with his usual calm demeanor. "How'd you sleep?" Good," Danny replied, his voice still hesitant, unsure of what to say. "Really good." Barron stepped into the room and set the tray down on the small table by the window. "Eat up," he said. "You've got a big day ahead of you." Danny sat down, still processing everything that had happened. His mind raced, trying to piece together the night and this strange new reality that Barron had thrust upon him. He picked up a fork, unsure of how to begin. As he took the first bite, the warmth and comfort of the food seemed to ground him, as though he were finally coming back to life after so much time spent surviving. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't just existing, he was truly living. While Danny ate, Barron took a seat across from him, his eyes steady and patient. He wasn't in a rush. This was about more than just taking care of Danny's immediate needs. It was about giving him the tools to change his life, to believe in his potential. Barron could see the wariness in Danny's eyes, the quiet reluctance that still clung to him, like a shadow he couldn't shake. But Barron knew that would take time. Trust didn't come easy when you'd been let down by the world for so long. "Danny," Barron said. his voice breaking through the boy's silent thoughts. I know you've been through a lot, but I want to help you get back on your feet. You're not alone anymore. You have a chance to build something, and I'm here to help you with that. But it's going to take work. Danny glanced up, his fork halfway to his mouth. He couldn't quite comprehend what Barron was saying. Was this real? Was it really possible for someone like him, a kid who had spent most of his life bouncing between shelters and the streets, to have a real shot at something better? I'm going to set you up with a tutor, Barron continued. You've missed a lot of school, but we're going to fix that. I've already made the arrangements. You'll catch up, and we'll make sure you can finish your education. Danny's chest tightened at the thought. School? He hadn't been to a classroom in over a year. The thought of sitting in a desk, of learning again, felt like a distant fantasy. But Barron's unwavering certainty planted a seed of hope in his chest, a hope he hadn't dared feel in so long. Barron went on. You've got a dream, right? You said you wanted to build rockets and cars. I want to help you make that happen. You're going to see how we make the cars at Tesla, maybe even visit SpaceX. I'll introduce you to engineers who can show you how it all works. You've got potential, Danny. You just need the right opportunity. The words felt like a fire being kindled inside Danny. Rockets, cars, things he had dreamed of but had never thought were possible for someone like him. Could it be true? Could someone really see him not as just another homeless kid, but as someone with promise, with a future? Why are you doing this for me? Danny asked, his voice barely above a whisper, the question hanging in the air. I'm just a kid. I don't have anything. Barron's eyes softened. Because I believe in you, Danny. I've been where you are, struggling to make something of myself. Someone once believed in me, and now it's my turn to do the same for you. You've got everything you need to succeed, you just need to take the first step. For the first time, Danny felt a small spark of possibility light up inside him. He could do this. He could chase those dreams, build rockets, make something of himself. The weight of his past, the heavy burden of being forgotten, began to lift, replaced by the weight of potential, of a future that could be anything he wanted it to be. As Barron stood to leave, he turned back to Danny. Remember, this is just the beginning. Tomorrow, we'll figure out the next steps. But for now, get some rest, take it all in. You deserve it. Danny nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time he had hope. A new beginning had just started, and for the first time in a long time, he was ready to take that first step into it.